The morning light filtered through the curtains of Sarah Mitchell's modest apartment in the Riverside district, casting golden stripes across her grandmother's old quilt that still covered her bed after all these years. She had barely slept, her mind rehearsing every argument, every precedent, every possible question the justices might throw at her today. At 30 years old, Sarah had spent the last decade climbing a mountain that most people who looked like her were never expected to summit. And today she would stand before the highest court in the land, representing the Johnsons, a black family wrongfully evicted from their home by a property management company that had systematically discriminated against them for years. The alarm clock on her nightstand read 5:30 in the morning, but she had been awake since 4, her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind the way it always did before important moments. "Baby girl," Grandma Rose used to say while flipping pancakes on Sunday mornings after church at the First Baptist Community Chapel, the syrup sweet and sticky on their fingers. "One day, you're gonna stand where they never thought a girl like you could stand. And when that day comes, you remember that your worth ain't something they can give you or take away." Sarah had grown up in the South Side neighborhoods of the city, where corner stores sold day-old bread at discount prices, and the sound of sirens was as common as birdsong, where her mother worked double shifts as a nurse at Mercy General Hospital, and her father drove trucks cross-country, gone for weeks at a time, bringing back postcards from places like Memphis and Albuquerque, and stories about diners where the apple pie was still homemade. The smell of her mother's coffee now filled the small apartment, that rich, dark roast from the Colombian beans she bought at Martinez Market down the street, and Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into her palms as she stared at the navy blue suit hanging on the back of her closet door, pressed and perfect, her armor for the day ahead. She thought about the case, about Mrs. Johnson's tears when they had first met at the offices of Crawford and Associates, the firm where Sarah had spent 7 years proving herself over and over again, working twice as hard for half the recognition, staying late into the night when her white colleagues went home to their families in the suburbs, mastering every detail of constitutional law and civil rights precedent until she knew it better than anyone in that building. The Johnsons had lived in their home for 15 years, raised 3 children there, planted a garden where tomatoes grew fat and red in the summer sun, and then one day, the new property management company, Silverstone Property Group, had decided they didn't fit the image they wanted for the neighborhood that was being gentrified block by block, coffee shop by organic grocery store by artisan bakery. Sarah had seen the pattern in dozens of cases, the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that people were pushed out of communities they had built. But this case was different because the evidence was so clear, so damning. Internal emails that talked about changing the demographic and attracting a different clientele. Words that meant everything and nothing in a courtroom, depending on who was listening. She finished her coffee and moved through her morning routine with the precision of ritual, shower hot enough to steam the mirror, hair pulled back into a neat bun that her mother had taught her to do when she was 12 years old and insisted on looking professional for her first debate competition, makeup subtle but present because she had learned that you had to be put together in a way that was perfect but not too perfect, competent but not threatening, smart but not intimidating, a tightrope walk that exhausted her some days but had become second nature over the years. The suit fit perfectly, tailored by Mrs. Chen at the alteration shop on 5th Street, who had given her a discount when Sarah told her what it was for. And when Sarah looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not just herself, but all the women who had come before her. Her grandmother, who had marched in the 60s with signs demanding justice. Her mother, who had fought to become head nurse at a hospital that didn't want black women in leadership. Her aunts and cousins, and the women at church who had prayed over her when she got her acceptance letter to Columbia Law School, their hands warm on her shoulders as they thanked Jesus for opening doors. She gathered her briefcase, leather worn soft from years of use, stuffed with notes and precedents and arguments that she had refined until they gleamed like polished stones. And she said a prayer the way Grandma Rose had taught her. Lord, give me strength, not just for myself, but for all the people counting on me today. Let my words be clear and my purpose be true, and let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Words from Amos, the Dr. King had made famous, and that still rang true in moments like this. The drive downtown took 40 minutes through traffic that was already building, past the McDonald's where teenagers gathered before school, past the strip mall with the check-cashing place and the nail salon, and the Chinese restaurant that made the best lo mein she had ever tasted, past the neighborhoods that gradually shifted from working class to middle class, to the gleaming towers of the financial district where people in expensive suits walked with the confidence of those who had never been questioned about whether they belonged. Sarah parked in the public garage 3 blocks from the courthouse, expensive but necessary. And as she walked toward the imposing granite building with its columns and steps and flags flying in the morning breeze, she felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders like a mantle. The federal courthouse stood before her like a temple to justice, massive and intimidating. And Sarah had been inside dozens of times for smaller cases and hearings. But today was different, because today she would argue before the Supreme Court justices who were visiting for a special session on civil rights cases, a rare honor that came once in a career, if you were lucky. She climbed the steps slowly, her heels clicking on the stone, her mind focused on the opening statement she had practiced so many times that she could recite it in her sleep. And she was 3 steps from the entrance when a voice called out behind her, sharp and authoritative in a way that made her spine stiffen. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. You need to move along." Sarah turned to see a white police officer, maybe 40 years old, with a thick neck and a crew cut, his hand resting casually on his belt as he looked her up and down with the kind of assessment that she had learned to recognize years ago, the look that said, "You don't belong here." She took a breath and kept her voice calm and professional. "Good morning, officer. I'm an attorney, and I have business inside the courthouse this morning." The officer, whose nameplate read Mitchell, stepped closer with a skeptical expression that made something hot and familiar rise in her chest. "Yeah, I'm sure you do, but I'm going to need to see some identification, and you're going to need to explain what you think you're doing trying to enter a federal building." Sarah reached slowly for her briefcase, moving deliberately so as not to startle him, because she had learned that lesson too, how any sudden movement could be interpreted as threatening when you looked like she did. "Officer, I'm a lawyer with Crawford and Associates. I'm scheduled to argue a case this morning. I have all my credentials right here." But Officer Mitchell wasn't listening. He was already speaking into his radio, calling for backup, and Sarah felt the familiar cocktail of rage and humiliation and exhaustion that came with moments like this, moments that happened more often than anyone who didn't live in her skin could understand. A crowd was beginning to gather, people on their way to work, other lawyers with briefcases, tourists taking pictures of the historic building, and Sarah could feel their eyes on her, some curious, some sympathetic, some indifferent. And she saw a young black girl, maybe 14 or 15, standing across the street with her phone out, recording everything. Officer Mitchell's backup arrived, 2 more officers who flanked him with their hands near their weapons, and the scene was escalating in a way that made Sarah's heart pound, even as her face remained calm. "Ma'am, I don't care what you say you are. This building is for official business only, and you need to leave now before we have to arrest you for trespassing." The words hung in the air like smoke, bitter and choking, and Sarah felt herself standing at a crossroads that she had been preparing for her entire life without knowing it. She could comply, walk away, call her firm, reschedule, avoid the confrontation that would surely go viral in today's world, where everyone had cameras and social media accounts hungry for content. She could protect herself from the headlines and the scrutiny and the judgment that would come from being the angry black woman who made a scene. Or she could do what her grandmother had taught her, stand firm in her dignity and refuse to be moved from the place where she had every right to be. Her mind flashed back to law school, to Professor Weinstein's office, where he had called her in after she had demolished a classmate's argument in constitutional law, and the classmate had complained that she was too aggressive. "Sarah," the professor had said, his voice kind but firm, "you are brilliant, one of the best students I've taught in 20 years. But you need to understand that you'll face different standards than your peers. You'll have to be twice as good and keep twice as calm, because the world isn't fair, and if you want to change it, you have to survive it first." She had hated those words then, and she hated them now. But she also knew they were true, had proven them true 100 times in courtrooms and conference rooms and networking events where she was the only person who looked like her. The crowd was growing larger. Phones pointed at her like accusations or evidence, and she heard murmurs rippling through the gathering, some people defending her, others silent. And Officer Mitchell was reaching for his handcuffs, his face set in the stubborn expression of someone who had decided on a course of action and would not be deterred. "Officer, I am an attorney with business in this building. I am not trespassing, and I am asking you respectfully to allow me to proceed." Her voice was steady, but she could feel the tremor underneath, the rage that wanted to explode, the frustration of having this conversation again, the exhaustion of being questioned and doubted and dismissed. And she thought about the Johnsons waiting somewhere inside that building, counting on her, trusting that she would be their voice when they had been silenced for so long. Officer Mitchell moved closer, invading her space in a way that was meant to intimidate. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. You need to leave now or you will be arrested for trespassing and obstruction of justice." The irony of those words, obstruction of justice, when justice was exactly what she was here to pursue, made something crack inside her careful composure. Her hand moved to her briefcase, fingers trembling slightly as she opened it, and she could see the officer tense, his hand moving toward his weapon, and she froze because she knew how this could end, had seen the news stories too many times, black bodies on concrete, hashtags and protests and promises of reform that never quite materialized. The young girl across the street was still recording, her phone steady, bearing witness the way someone needed to bear witness to moments like this. And Sarah thought about what that girl was seeing, what lessons she was learning about authority and justice, and who gets to occupy space in America. Her fingers found the edge of her Supreme Court credential badge, the one that allowed her to argue before the highest court in the land, the one that marked her as belonging to the most exclusive legal club in the country. And she felt the smooth metal under her fingertips, like a talisman. This was her choice. Her moment to decide who she would be, whether she would quietly comply with injustice to avoid conflict or stand firm in the truth of who she was and what she had earned. And she thought about Grandma Rose watching from somewhere beyond this morning, thought about all the prayers and sacrifices and dreams that had brought her to these steps. And she knew what she had to do, even as her heart hammered in her chest and her palms grew damp with sweat that had nothing to do with the morning sun climbing higher in the sky. Sarah's fingers closed around the Supreme Court badge, and she pulled it from her briefcase with a deliberate slowness that made time itself seem to pause, the metal catching the morning light and throwing it back like a mirror, reflecting truth into darkness. Officer Mitchell's eyes widened as he recognized the distinctive emblem, the eagle and the scales of justice that marked her not just as an attorney, but as one of the rare few granted the privilege to argue before the nation's highest court. And his face underwent a transformation that Sarah had seen before, but never quite this dramatically, the color draining from his ruddy cheeks as understanding crashed over him like a wave breaking against rocks. "I am Attorney Sarah Mitchell," she said, her voice steady now and filled with a quiet power that came from knowing she held all the cards in a game she had never wanted to play. "And I am arguing before the Supreme Court justices in exactly 37 minutes, so I'm going to ask you one more time. Am I free to enter the building where I have official business, or are you going to arrest a Supreme Court attorney on the steps of a federal courthouse while dozens of people record it for the entire world to see?" The crowd had grown to maybe 50 people now, a semicircle of witnesses with their phones raised like digital torches, and Sarah could hear the gasps rippling through them, the whispered exclamations of disbelief and vindication. And she saw the young black girl across the street with tears streaming down her face, her phone still recording, but her other hand pressed against her heart as if to keep it from bursting. Officer Mitchell stepped back, his hand falling away from his belt, and his two backup officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their sudden desire to be anywhere else in the world. "Ma'am, I apologize. There was a misunderstanding. You're free to go. Of course you're free to go." "Do." But Sarah stood her ground for a moment longer because she needed him to understand, needed all of them to understand, that this was not just about her, but about every person who had been judged by their appearance rather than their credentials. Every black and brown body that had been deemed suspicious or out of place or threatening simply for existing in spaces that some people believed belonged only to them. "Officer Mitchell," she said, and her voice carried across the steps with a clarity that made people lean in to hear, "I need you to understand something. I didn't just appear here this morning. I earned my place here through 14 years of education, 7 years of practicing law, countless nights of studying while my colleagues were out drinking beer and watching football, and I have every right to walk through these doors, not because I showed you a badge, but because I am a human being, and an American citizen and an officer of the court." The shame on Officer Mitchell's face was almost painful to witness, his eyes unable to meet hers, and Sarah felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness because she knew that this moment would change nothing for him unless he chose to let it. That he would go home tonight and maybe tell his wife about the mistake he made, or maybe not. That tomorrow he would put on his uniform again and patrol these same streets with the same assumptions baked into his training and his experience. She walked past him and up the remaining steps, her heels clicking with a rhythm that sounded like triumph but felt like exhaustion. And as she reached the top, she turned back to see the crowd still watching, still recording. And she knew that by noon, this would be everywhere. Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, the hashtags already forming in her mind. And part of her wanted to disappear into the building and pretend it hadn't happened, but another part of her, the part that sounded like Grandma Rose, knew that this was meant to be, that sometimes injustice had to be witnessed in order to be believed. The young girl from across the street had crossed over now and was standing at the bottom of the steps, her eyes wide and shining with something that looked like hope mixed with heartbreak. "Excuse me," the girl called out, her voice thin and uncertain but brave. "Are you really a Supreme Court lawyer?" Sarah paused, her hand on the heavy bronze door, and looked down at this child who reminded her so much of herself at that age, hungry for proof that the impossible was possible, that the doors that seemed closed could actually open if you pushed hard enough and long enough. "Yes, baby, I am," Sarah said, and her voice was gentle now, stripped of the armor she had needed with the officer. "And one day, if you want it bad enough and work hard enough, you can be too. Don't let anybody tell you different." The girl nodded, tears still falling, and Sarah wanted to say more, wanted to tell her about all the times she had doubted herself, all the doors that had been slammed in her face, all the nights she had cried in her car in parking lots, because the weight of being the only one was sometimes more than she could bear. But she had a case to argue, and time was slipping away like sand through fingers. Inside the courthouse, the cool, air-conditioned atmosphere was a shock after the heat of the morning sun and the burning of public humiliation. And Sarah walked through the marble halls, past the portraits of judges and justices, all those serious white faces staring down from their frames, and she thought about how few faces like hers hung on these walls, how much had changed and how much remained stubbornly the same. Her phone was buzzing in her bag, text messages flooding in from colleagues who had already seen the video, from her mother, who was probably having a heart attack in the break room at Mercy General Hospital, from friends and law school classmates, and people she hadn't heard from in years, all of them shocked or supportive or asking if she was okay, and she turned the phone off because she couldn't deal with any of it right now, couldn't let the noise of the world drown out the focus she needed. For the next 2 hours, the waiting area outside the Supreme Court chamber was lined with dark wood and leather chairs that creaked when you sat in them, and Sarah found a corner away from the other attorneys who were gathered in small clusters, talking in low voices about their cases and their strategies, and she could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic and some calculating, wondering if the morning's incident would affect her performance, if she would be too rattled to argue effectively. Marcus Chen from her firm appeared beside her, his face concerned, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "Sarah, I just saw the video. Are you okay? Do you need anything? We can ask for a continuance if you need more time." But Sarah shook her head, because continuance meant delay, and delay meant the Johnsons would have to wait even longer for justice, would have to spend more nights lying awake, wondering if their home was truly lost. If the system that had failed them so many times would fail them again. "I'm fine, Marcus. I'm going to do this. I need to do this." Marcus nodded, understanding without needing explanation, and he handed her a bottle of water from the vending machine down the hall, cold and sweating condensation, and she drank it gratefully, letting the coolness wash away some of the heat that still burned in her chest. She closed her eyes and let herself drift back to the memory of Grandma Rose, not the hospital room at the end when cancer had stolen her strength and her voice, but the kitchen on Sunday mornings when the whole family gathered after church at First Baptist Community Chapel. The services that lasted 3 hours with singing and testifying, and Reverend Johnson preaching about Moses leading his people to freedom, about Daniel in the lion's den, about Esther who risked everything to save her. People. Grandma Rose would make her famous peach cobbler, the fruit sweet and bubbling under a crust that was both crispy and tender, and she would tell stories about growing up in Alabama, about sitting in the colored section of the movie theater, about drinking from separate water fountains, about the day she and Grandpa James had packed everything they owned into a Ford station wagon and driven north to the city, looking for work and dignity and a chance to raise their children somewhere that offered at least the possibility of equality. "Baby girl," Grandma Rose had said to her when Sarah was 15 and furious about being followed around in the department store at Riverside Mall by a security guard who assumed she was there to steal. "I know it hurts. I know it makes you so angry you could spit fire. But you listen to me now. Your dignity is your superpower. It's the one thing they can't take from you unless you give it away. You hold your head high and you be so good at whatever you do that they can't ignore you. You make them see you not as what they expect, but as who you really are." Sarah had carried those words through high school, where she was one of 3 black students in the honors program, through college at State University, where she joined the Black Student Union and studied until her eyes burned and her fingers cramped from typing papers about civil rights law and constitutional theory, through law school at Columbia, where she met Professor Weinstein, who became her mentor and pushed her harder than anyone had ever pushed her, because he believed she could be great. If she survived the grinding process of becoming a lawyer in a system that was not designed with people like her in mind. She remembered the day she got the letter from Crawford and Associates, the big firm downtown with offices on the 30th floor of the Sentinel Tower, offering her a position as an associate, and how her mother had cried and called everyone she knew to share the news. and how her father had driven home early from a long haul to take her to dinner at Riverside Steakhouse, the fancy place where they served massive porterhouse steaks and loaded baked potatoes, and the waiters wore bow ties. And he had told her he was proud of her in that gruff way he had, his voice catching on the words. The years at Crawford and Associates had been brutal in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. The late nights working on cases that more senior attorneys would take credit for, the assignments to research obscure precedents while her white colleagues got FaceTime with clients, the subtle and not so subtle messages that she was lucky to be there, that she should be grateful for the opportunity, that she shouldn't make waves or complain or point out the inequities she saw every day. But she had persevered because that was what you did, because giving up meant letting down not just herself, but all the people who had invested in her success. And slowly, painfully, she had built a reputation as someone who was meticulous and brilliant and unshakable. And when the Johnson case had come across her desk, she had known immediately that this was the one, the case that mattered, the case that could make a difference. The Johnsons were a family like her own family, working people who believed in the American dream, even when that dream seemed to believe in everyone but them. And when Mrs. Johnson had sat across from her in the conference room, with its view of the city skyline, and told her story about the eviction notice and the lies from Silverstone Property Group and the feeling of being erased from a neighborhood they had helped build, Sarah had seen her own grandmother in that woman's face, had heard echoes of her own family's struggles in that story. She had taken the case pro bono at first because the firm didn't want to touch something so controversial, something that might upset their real estate clients and their corporate partners. But she had worked on it in every spare moment, building an argument so airtight that even the most skeptical judge would have to acknowledge its merit. And when the case had been selected for the special Supreme Court session on civil rights, Sarah had felt both vindication and terror, knowing that this was her chance to prove herself on the biggest stage, but also knowing that the scrutiny would be intense and the pressure enormous. A bailiff appeared in the doorway, calling names, and Sarah stood, smoothing her skirt, checking that her notes were in order, taking one last deep breath before walking into the chamber where history was made and destroyed in equal measure. The Supreme Court chamber was smaller than she had imagined, but more intimidating. The high ceiling and dark wood paneling creating an atmosphere of gravitas that made every word feel weighted with importance. And the 9 justices sat behind their raised bench like a pantheon of legal gods, their faces serious and attentive as she approached the lectern. Her hands were shaking slightly as she placed her notes down, and she looked up at the justices, seeing not just them, but all the generations who had fought for the right to stand where she was standing. And she began to speak, her voice clear and strong, despite the morning's trauma, despite the video that was probably being shared millions of times while she stood here, despite everything. Sarah's opening statement flowed from her lips like water that had been dammed up too long, each word carefully chosen and delivered with a precision that came from weeks of practice and a lifetime of preparation. And she could see the justices leaning forward slightly, their attention caught by the strength of her argument and the clarity of her presentation. Your Honours, this case is fundamentally about whether the Fair Housing Act means what it says, whether the promise of equal access to housing regardless of race is a genuine protection or merely words on paper that can be circumvented through coded language and discriminatory practices that hide behind business justifications. She walked them through the evidence, the internal emails from Silverstone Property Group that talked about wanting to attract a different clientele, the statistical analysis showing that Black and Hispanic tenants were evicted at rates 3 times higher than white tenants for identical lease violations, the testimony from property managers who had been instructed to find reasons to remove families that didn't fit the demographic profile the company wanted. Justice Rodriguez, the newest member of the court and the first Latina justice, asked a question about intent versus impact. whether the plaintiffs needed to prove that Silverstone deliberately targeted them because of race, or whether the disparate impact was sufficient, and Sarah had anticipated this question, had prepared for it with the kind of thoroughness that had become her trademark. Your Honor, while we have substantial evidence of deliberate intent in this case, the precedent established in Texas Department of Housing versus Inclusive Communities project makes clear that disparate impact alone can constitute a violation of the Fair Housing Act. The law recognizes that discrimination often operates through seemingly neutral policies that have discriminatory effects. The back and forth continued. Questions from Justice Chen about remedies and damages, from Justice O'Brien about the scope of the ruling and whether it would apply to other property management companies, from Justice Williams about the line between legitimate business decisions and discriminatory practices. And Sarah fielded each question with a confidence that surprised even herself, given what had happened just an hour before on the courthouse steps. But then, Justice Blackwell, a conservative jurist known for his skepticism of civil rights claims, leaned forward with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. Counselor Mitchell, you're asking this court to essentially second-guess the business decisions of a private company based on statistical disparities that could have multiple explanations. How do we draw the line between protecting civil rights and interfering with the free market? Sarah paused, and in that pause she felt the weight of the morning pressing down on her. The humiliation of being stopped and questioned and threatened with arrest, the exhaustion of having to prove her worth over and over again, and something inside her shifted, a decision made in the space of a heartbeat that she would not play it safe, would not give the careful, measured response that her training told her was appropriate. Your Honor, with respect, I'd like to offer a real-world application of this question, she said, and she could feel the tension in the room sharpen, sense the other attorneys behind her holding their breath. 3 hours ago, I was stopped on the steps of this courthouse by a police officer who assumed I was trespassing, who threatened to arrest me, who called for backup with their hands on their weapons. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I am a black woman, and apparently that made me suspicious in his eyes. The courtroom went utterly still, a silence so profound that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. And she saw Justice Rodriguez's eyes widen slightly, saw Justice Chen sit back in his chair, and she knew she was crossing a line, but she also knew that sometimes lines needed to be crossed. I share this not to complain or seek sympathy, but to illustrate the point that discrimination operates through assumptions and biases that seem reasonable to the people holding them. That officer probably genuinely believed he was doing his job, protecting the courthouse from someone who didn't belong. Just as Silverstone Property Group probably believes they're making sound business decisions to improve their properties and attract better tenants, but the impact of those beliefs, the real-world consequences for families like the Johnsons, is that they are pushed out of their homes, displaced from their communities, treated as problems to be solved rather than human beings with rights and dignity. She could see opposing counsel shifting uncomfortably at his table, probably calculating whether to object, but Chief Justice Morrison raised a hand slightly, indicating that Sarah should continue. The Johnsons are not statistics, Your Honors. They are a family. James Johnson is a deacon at Greater Hope Missionary Church. He coaches Little League Baseball on weekends. He works as a mechanic at Anderson Auto Repair. His wife Patricia is a teacher's aide at Lincoln Elementary School. They have 3 children who have grown up in that house, who have measured their heights on the doorframe of the kitchen, who have friends and memories and roots in that neighborhood. And Silverstone Property Group decided they didn't fit the image, used pretexts about late rent payments that were actually paid on time, about property damage that was actually normal wear and tear, about noise complaints that were never substantiated, all to justify removing a black family from a neighborhood that was being whitened block by block. Her voice had risen slightly, emotion creeping in around the edges of her professional composure, and she took a breath, steadied herself, found the calm center that Grandma Rose had taught her to access through prayer and meditation. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 in the wake of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Its assassination as a promise that America would finally live up to its ideals, that housing discrimination would no longer be legal or acceptable, and if this court allows Silverstone's actions to stand, if we say that coded language and pretextual justifications are sufficient to circumvent civil rights protections, then that promise means nothing. Then the Johnsons and families like them across this country have no recourse when they are targeted simply for being who they are. Justice Blackwell was watching her intently now, his expression unreadable, and Sarah felt the full force of the moment, understood that she had just done something unprecedented, had brought her personal experience into a Supreme Court argument in a way that was either brilliant or career-ending, and she wouldn't know which until the decision came down months from now. The rest of the argument proceeded more conventionally. Questions about legal standards and burdens of proof and appellate procedure. And when her time was up and she returned to her seat, her legs felt weak and her hands were trembling again. The adrenaline that had carried her through now draining away and leaving exhaustion in its wake. If you're finding this story powerful and inspiring, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel so you never miss content like this. Click the notification bell to stay updated and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts with the words, "A story of dignity standing strong," to let us know this message resonated with you. Outside the chamber, Marcus was waiting with the expression that was half admiration and half concern. "Sarah, that was incredible, but also completely insane. You just told the Supreme Court about being racially profiled this morning. Do you realize what you've done?" Sarah nodded slowly, sinking into one of the leather chairs that lined the hallway, her body suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "I know, Marcus, I know it was risky, but in that moment, it felt like the only honest thing I could do. I couldn't just argue the case in abstract legal terms when the whole point is that these aren't abstract issues, they're real people's lives." Her phone, which she had turned back on, was exploding with notifications. The video from the courthouse steps now viral in the truest sense of the word. Over 10 million views in 3 hours, trending on every social media platform, news outlets picking it up, commentary from legal experts and civil rights activists, and random people with opinions. The headlines were already writing themselves. Black Supreme Court attorney racially profiled before arguing civil rights case. Lawyer stopped by police uses experience in court testimony. Viral video shows attorney confronting officer with Supreme Court badge. And Sarah felt dizzy reading them, understanding that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't fully process yet. Her mother had left 7 voicemails, her voice escalating from concern to panic to pride. And Sarah called her back from a quiet corner near the vending machines that sold stale sandwiches and bags of chips. "Mama, I'm okay. I promise I'm okay." Her mother was crying, the sound crackling through the phone connection. "Baby, I saw the video. I saw that officer treating you like you were nobody, like all your degrees and all your hard work meant nothing, and it broke my heart, but then I saw you stand up to him, saw you show him who you were, and I thought about your grandmother watching from heaven and smiling because you did exactly what she taught you to do." Sarah's own tears came then, silent and hot, running down her cheeks and dripping onto her navy suit. "Mama, I don't know if I did the right thing, bringing it into the court argument. I might have just ruined my career." But her mother's voice was fierce with certainty. "Sarah Rose Mitchell, you listen to me now. You did exactly the right thing. You told the truth, and the truth is what sets people free. Your grandmother used to say that all the time, quoting from the Gospel of John, and she was right. You can't fight for justice while hiding the injustice you face. That's not how change happens." They talked for a few more minutes, her mother sharing messages from aunts and cousins and church members who had all seen the video and were praying for her, from Reverend Thompson at First Baptist Community Chapel, who wanted to dedicate Sunday's sermon to her courage, from neighbors and community members who were calling her a hero, and Sarah felt both humbled and overwhelmed by the attention, by the sudden transformation from private attorney to public symbol. When she hung up, she found a text from Professor Weinstein at Columbia, brief but meaningful. "Proud of you, that took guts. Call me when you can." The waiting began then, the long, uncertain period between argument and decision that could stretch for months. And Sarah knew she needed to figure out what came next, how to handle the media requests that were surely coming, how to navigate a spotlight she had never sought, but now couldn't avoid. She gathered her things and walked back through the courthouse, past the security checkpoints and metal detectors, past the other attorneys and court personnel who stared at her with recognition now. And when she emerged onto the steps where the morning's confrontation had occurred, she found a crowd of reporters waiting, cameras and microphones thrust toward her like weapons or offerings, depending on your perspective. "Ms. Mitchell, can you comment on the incident this morning? Do you think the officer's actions were motivated by racism? Will you be filing a complaint against the police department? How do you think your testimony in court will affect the case?" The questions came rapid fire, overlapping and insistent, and Sarah raised her hand for quiet, waiting until the noise subsided to something manageable. "I'll make a brief statement, and then I need to get back to my office." The cameras focused, the reporters fell silent, and Sarah spoke with the same clarity she had used in the courtroom. "This morning I experienced something that millions of Black and brown Americans experience regularly, being questioned about whether I belong in spaces where I have every right to be. It was frustrating and humiliating, but it was also a reminder of why cases like the one I argued today matter so much." She paused, choosing her words carefully because she knew they would be quoted and analyzed and debated. "I don't believe Officer Mitchell is a bad person. I believe he's a product of a system that teaches us to make assumptions based on appearance, that codes certain bodies as suspicious or dangerous or out of place. And until we acknowledge those biases and work actively to change them, we will continue to see incidents like this morning's. We will continue to see families like the Johnsons pushed out of their homes. We will continue to fall short of the ideals this nation claims to uphold." A reporter from Channel 7 News called out, "Do you think what happened this morning will influence the Supreme Court's decision?" Sarah shook her head. "The Supreme Court will decide this case based on law and precedent and the strength of the arguments presented, but I hope that my experience this morning illustrated in a concrete way what discrimination looks like in practice, how it operates through assumptions that seem reasonable until you're on the receiving end of them." She saw the young black girl from earlier standing at the edge of the crowd, still clutching her phone. And Sarah made eye contact with her, smiled slightly, and the girl smiled back with a joy that was almost painful to witness. "One last thing," Sarah added. "I want every young person watching this, especially young Black and brown kids, to know that you belong everywhere, in courtrooms and boardrooms and classrooms and any other room you choose to enter. Don't let anyone make you question your worth or your right to occupy space in this world." She walked away then, ignoring the follow-up questions, moving toward the parking garage where her car waited, and she felt simultaneously exhausted and energized, drained and somehow more alive than she had felt in years, as if some essential truth about herself had been revealed and acknowledged in a way that made pretending impossible. The weeks that followed the argument felt like living in a hurricane, where the eye kept shifting, moments of calm punctuated by storms of media attention and public debate that Sarah had never anticipated when she chose to become a lawyer all those years ago. The video from the courthouse steps had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms, spawned countless think pieces in newspapers and magazines, become fodder for cable news debates where pundits argued about racial profiling and professional respect and the state of justice in America, and Sarah found herself thrust into a role she had never auditioned for, symbol and spokesperson and lightning rod all at once. Crawford and Associates had responded with carefully worded support, releasing a statement about their commitment to diversity and inclusion while privately expressing concern about the controversy affecting their corporate clients. And Sarah had attended tense meetings in the firm's mahogany-paneled conference room on the 30th floor of Sentinel Tower, where senior partners asked her pointed questions about her plans and whether she intended to pursue legal action against the police department. She had declined interviews with major news networks, turned down invitation after invitation to appear on morning shows and evening panels, wanting to preserve some semblance of privacy and focus while waiting for the Supreme Court's decision. But the requests kept coming, phone calls and emails and messages through every possible channel, producers and journalists and documentary filmmakers all wanting a piece of her story. Her mother had started keeping a scrapbook, printing out articles and blog posts and social media tributes, organizing them in a thick leather-bound album that sat on the coffee table in her apartment next to the Bible, and the collection of Reader's Digest magazines she liked to read during her breaks from nursing. The Johnsons had reached out through Marcus, wanting to thank her and express their gratitude, and Sarah had met them for lunch at Mama Rosa's Italian restaurant, a family-owned place in their neighborhood where the lasagna was thick with cheese and meat sauce, and the garlic bread came hot from the oven wrapped in foil. Mrs. Johnson had hugged her tight, this woman in her 60s, with grey streaking through her dark hair and hands rough from years of work, and she had whispered, "You are our Daniel in the lion's den. God sent you to us." And Sarah had felt the weight of that faith, the responsibility of carrying not just legal arguments, but the hopes and prayers of people who had been disappointed by the system too many times to count. The Supreme Court's decision came on a Tuesday morning in late November, 3 months after the argument, dropping like a thunderclap through the legal community and rippling out into the broader culture. Sarah was at her desk when Marcus burst in with his tablet, his face split by a grin so wide it looked painful. "Sarah, we won, 7-2. The court ruled in favor of the Johnsons, upheld the Fair Housing Act's disparate impact provision, cited your testimony about systemic bias. This is huge. This is massive." She read the decision with trembling hands. Justice Rodriguez's majority opinion that walked through the evidence methodically and concluded that Silverstone Property Group had violated federal law, that the pretextual justifications for evicting the Johnsons were insufficient to mask the discriminatory intent and impact, that property management companies could not hide behind business justifications while engaging in practices that had racially discriminatory effects. The opinion quoted Sarah's courtroom testimony about her experience on the courthouse steps, using it as an example of how bias operates through assumptions that seem reasonable to those holding them, and reading her own words, reflected back through the lens of Supreme Court precedent, felt surreal, like looking at yourself in a funhouse mirror that somehow made everything clearer rather than more distorted. Justice Chen had written a concurring opinion that went even further, arguing for stronger enforcement mechanisms and more robust penalties for housing discrimination, while Justices Blackwell and Thompson had dissented, claiming the majority was overreaching and interfering with private business decisions. But the 7-2 margin was decisive, a clear victory that would reshape housing discrimination law for decades to come. Sarah's phone was ringing before she finished reading. Her mother crying tears of joy, reporters seeking comment, civil rights organizations wanting to celebrate the victory, and Crawford and Associates suddenly much more enthusiastic about her presence in the firm now that she had won one of the most significant civil rights cases in recent memory. The press conference was held at the courthouse, the same steps where she had been stopped and humiliated, and this time, when Sarah stood there, it was with the Johnsons beside her, with Marcus and other attorneys from the firm, with representatives from the NAACP and the American Civil Liberties Union, and a dozen other organizations that had filed amicus briefs supporting their case. The crowd was enormous. Hundreds of people filling the plaza in front of the courthouse, and Sarah could see signs and banners, "Justice for the Johnsons," "Housing rights are civil rights," "Black excellence." And she felt overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment, by the realization that they had actually won something meaningful. 3 months ago, I stood on these steps and was told I didn't belong here, Sarah said into the microphone, her voice carrying across the crowd through the sound system that had been set up for the occasion. Today, I stand here again to announce that the Supreme Court has affirmed that families like the Johnsons do belong in their homes, in their communities, in the neighborhoods they have built and sustained, and that discrimination, whether blatant or subtle, whether intentional or merely impactful, will not be tolerated under federal law. Mrs. Johnson spoke next, her voice shaking but strong, talking about what it meant to have their home back, to have their dignity affirmed, to know that the system had finally worked for them instead of against them. And Mr. Johnson stood beside his wife with tears streaming down his face, this man who had served in the army and worked hard his entire life and never asked for anything except to be treated fairly. The questions from reporters were mostly friendly now, asking about the broader implications of the decision, about what came next for Sarah's career, about whether she would continue taking civil rights cases, and she answered carefully, aware that every word would be analyzed and quoted, but also feeling a freedom she hadn't felt before, a sense that she had earned the right to speak truth without constantly calculating the cost. Officer Mitchell was there, standing at the edge of the crowd in civilian clothes, and when Sarah noticed him, their eyes met across the distance, and he nodded slightly, an acknowledgement that carried apology and respect. And she nodded back, because holding grudges was exhausting, and forgiveness was a gift you gave yourself as much as the other person. The department had implemented new training programs on implicit bias and de-escalation, had revised their policies about interactions with the public, and while Sarah knew that training alone wouldn't solve systemic problems, it was a start, a recognition that change was necessary. In the weeks after the decision, Sarah's life transformed in ways both welcome and challenging, speaking invitations from law schools and conferences, job offers from civil rights organizations and government agencies, requests to write articles and even a book about her experience, and she navigated it all with the same careful deliberation she brought to legal work, saying yes to some opportunities and no to others, trying to find a balance between public engagement and private life. She took on more civil rights cases at Crawford and Associates, and the firm, recognizing both her talent and her marketability, made her the youngest partner in the firm's history, gave her an office with windows overlooking the city skyline and resources to build a practice focused on discrimination and civil rights law. The young black girl from the courthouse steps, whose name was Destiny Thomas and who was a sophomore at King High School, reached out through social media, and they began meeting monthly for coffee at Riverside Coffee House, the local chain that served overpriced lattes and played jazz music too loud. And Sarah found herself becoming a mentor in the way that Professor Weinstein had been for her, answering questions about law school and career paths and how to navigate a world that often seemed designed to keep people like them out. Destiny was brilliant and ambitious, wanted to be a civil rights attorney herself, and watching her light up when talking about justice and equality reminded Sarah of why she had chosen this path in the first place, reminded her that the struggle was never just about individual victories, but about opening doors for those coming behind you. Thanksgiving arrived, and Sarah's family gathered at her mother's apartment, the small space packed with aunts and uncles and cousins, the dining table extended with folding tables and covered with dishes that represented their history, sweet potato pie and collard greens and mac and cheese and ham glazed with brown sugar and pineapple, and Reverend Thompson from First Baptist Community Chapel said grace before the meal, thanking God for Sarah's victory and for the reminder that faith and persistence could move mountains. Her father, gruff and uncomfortable with emotion as always, pulled her aside after dinner, while everyone else was watching football in the living room, and told her in his quiet way that Grandma Rose would have been proud, that she had honored the family legacy. And Sarah hugged him tight, this man who had driven trucks across America so his children could have opportunities he never had, and she understood in that moment that her success was built on foundations laid by people who never got recognition or credit, but who sacrificed everything for the possibility that their children might have better. Christmas Eve found Sarah volunteering at Hope Community Center, the homeless shelter where she had spent holidays since law school, serving turkey and stuffing and mashed potatoes to people who had fallen through the cracks of society's safety net. And she talked with a woman named Gloria, who had been evicted from her apartment after a rent increase she couldn't afford, who had been living in her car with her 2 children until the shelter took them in. And Sarah listened to her story and took notes, because this was another case waiting to happen, another injustice that needed addressing. The new year arrived with celebrations and resolutions, and Sarah found herself reflecting on how much had changed in 12 months, how a single morning had transformed her from a competent but relatively anonymous attorney into a public figure whose name was recognized, whose story was taught in law school classes as an example of advocacy and courage. And she felt both pride and discomfort with the attention, understanding that visibility was a double-edged sword that brought opportunities, but also scrutiny and pressure. She started speaking publicly more often, accepting invitations to address law students at Columbia and Howard and Harvard, telling them about the reality of practicing civil rights law, about the emotional toll and the financial sacrifices and the absolute necessity of believing in something bigger than your own advancement. And she always ended these talks by invoking Grandma Rose's wisdom about dignity being a superpower, about holding your head high even when the world tries to make you bow. The spring brought more cases, more families facing discrimination in housing and employment and education, and Sarah's practice grew rapidly, hiring 2 associates and a paralegal, building a team dedicated to fighting systemic injustice one case at a time. And she found herself working longer hours than ever, but feeling more fulfilled because the work had purpose beyond billable hours and partner meetings. Officer Mitchell reached out requesting a meeting, and they sat in a diner called Betty's Place that served breakfast all day, the kind of place with red vinyl booths and laminated menus and waitresses who called everyone honey. And he apologized formally and completely, explaining that he had been going through his own transformation, taking classes on implicit bias, volunteering with community organizations, trying to understand how his assumptions had shaped his actions. And Sarah appreciated his honesty, told him that accountability required more than apology, but that she respected his efforts to change. They started an unlikely partnership, Sarah and Officer Mitchell, appearing together at community forums about police-community relations, telling their story as an example of how confrontation could lead to understanding if people were willing to do the difficult work of examining their biases and assumptions. And while some people criticized Sarah for working with him, she believed that change required building bridges, not just burning them, that transformation happened through relationship, not just resistance. The one-year anniversary of the courthouse steps incident was marked by a ceremony at Greater Hope Missionary Church. The congregation of mostly older black folks who had lived through the civil rights movement and saw in Sarah's story echoes of their own struggles, and they sang hymns that made her cry, "Amazing Grace" and "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," voices rising in harmony that felt like prayer made audible. And Pastor Williams preached about Esther and how she had used her position to save her people, how sometimes God places you exactly where you need to be, even when the path there is painful. Sarah stood at the pulpit during the ceremony and looked out at the faces watching her, young and old, hopeful and weary. And she thought about Grandma Rose and how her grandmother had sat in pews like this every Sunday, believing that faith could move mountains and that justice would eventually prevail. And she spoke about the journey from humiliation to vindication, from anger to purpose, from seeking revenge to pursuing reconciliation. And she told them that the badge she had shown, that mourning had given her authority, but that her true power came from something deeper, from the dignity and worth that every human being possessed, regardless of what credentials they carried or what positions they held. The young girl, Destiny, was there, sitting in the front row with her mother, and after the ceremony, she came up to Sarah and said she had decided to apply to law schools, that she wanted to follow in Sarah's footsteps, and Sarah felt the weight of legacy settling on her shoulders, the understanding that her story would inspire others to fight their own battles, to stand firm in their own moments of testing, and she gave Destiny her grandmother's Bible, the one her mother had found in the attic, with the note inside, passing it forward to the next generation as a symbol of continuity and hope. Walking out of the church that evening, Sarah looked up at the sky, turning purple and orange with sunset, and she thought about how far she had traveled from that morning on the courthouse steps, how pain had been transformed into purpose and humiliation into triumph. And she understood finally what Grandma Rose had been trying to teach her all along, that your worth is not determined by how others see you, but by how you see yourself, that dignity cannot be given or taken, but only recognized or ignored, and that justice, real justice, begins with the courage to stand firm in the truth of who you are, even when the whole world tells you to move along.